Guys, America's next biggest problem, the one that's already here, is simple. The world is starting to lose confidence in America's ability to manage its money. The U.S. is now sitting on roughly $38 trillion in national debt, and the major credit rating agencies are warning that our financial direction as a country is getting worse, not better. But before we talk about this downgrade that could be coming next, you need to understand why this matters in the first place, okay? And it's because every country in the world has what's called a credit rating, right? And countries have credit ratings for the exact same reason that you and I have a credit score, because countries borrow money and lenders, they want to know if they can trust that country, right? Just like a bank checks your credit score, other nations, big investors and global banks, they're checking America's credit rating before they decide to lend the U.S. money by buying U.S. Treasury bonds. So countries borrow money. Okay. Governments don't pay for everything with tax dollars alone, right? It takes more than your tax dollar to run America. Governments raise money by issuing bonds, right? Which bonds are just simply loans, okay? A bond is just an IOU. It's a loan from the person or entity buying the bond to the person or entity issuing the bond. The government issues a bond. Investors, including other countries, buy that bond. So the U.S. gets cash up front from countries buying U.S. bonds. And the investor or other countries, they get paid back later with interest, right? So think about it like this. When Japan, or let's say the UK, buys U.S. Treasury bonds, they're literally lending money to America. That's why every country has a credit rating. A credit rating tells the world, other countries, how risky it is to lend money to that country. So just like you wouldn't lend money to somebody with a 500 credit score, countries don't want to lend money to nations that look unstable or nations that are overloaded with debt. So the big three credit rating agencies for countries are S&P Global, Fitch, and Moody's. And all three of these credit rating agencies have already knocked the U.S. credit's rating down from AAA. But the reason this matters, guys, and the reason a future downgrade is a problem, a huge problem, and it's really still on the table, starts with understanding this. America survives financially because the world buys trillions of dollars in U.S. bonds every year. If the world starts seeing the U.S. as a riskier borrower, the world will then probably demand higher interest or less exposure to U.S. debt altogether. This is why the U.S. credit ratings matter to you as an investor or to us as consumers, right? The U.S. has already had our credit downgraded, but that's not the end of the story, guys. Here's the facts. S&P Global, they downgraded the U.S. credit rating back in 2011. Fitch, they downgraded the U.S. credit rating in 2023. And Moody's downgraded the U.S. credit rating just recently, 5 or 6 months ago, back in May. So for the first time ever, the U.S. no longer holds a AAA rating from any of the three global credit rating agencies, okay? And these credit rating agencies are now warning publicly that things are still moving in the wrong direction for the U.S. credit rating looking forward. That means another downgrade in the U.S. credit rating is possible, and it's on the table if the trajectory of how things are going doesn't change. Now, let me break this down a little further, okay? As I said, the U.S. now owes over $38 trillion in debt, right? The last $1 trillion was added in only about 70 days due to the federal government shutdown that just ended, right? That's crazy speed. We added $1 trillion in just over 70 days. Listen, today, the annual interest that we pay, America pays just to service the debt, has surged so much that it now is more than what we spend annually on national defense. Hear what I'm saying? We spend more on interest to service the debt annually than we spend on defending the nation. Also, keep this in mind. The U.S. government has not had any extra money left over at the end of a year since 2001. In other words, America is continually, perpetually operating at a deficit every single year. Now, last year, that deficit was $1.8 trillion in the hole. So America borrows money every single year just to stay afloat, no matter which political party's in charge. It doesn't matter, Democrats, Republican, whatever. And then there's this rising interest cost, so that when interest rates go up, the U.S. has to pay even more to keep up with the debt it already owes. This becomes dangerous, guys, when the debt pile is as big as it is. Okay. Just being real with you. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just giving you the facts, right? And trying to break it down to you in plain language so we can get this thing, because we need to know this. Now, those three rating agencies that I mentioned, they're just flat out worried about how the government, the American government, is behaving. Okay. Here's what they're seeing that's troubling to those credit rating agencies. They're seeing shutdown threats of the American government being shut down every 6 months or so, right? With another one, by the way, coming up at the end of January, perhaps. They also are seeing fights over raising the debt ceiling every year or two. They also see that the American government really has no long-term plan to fix any of the problems that it's showing in terms of how it governs and how it manages its money, right? Fitch called it erosion of governance, right? Then you had Moody. I think Moody said something like a weakening of long-term fiscal outlook, right? Basically meaning the future of our money situation in America doesn't look that promising. And so, yes, those statements by these credit rating agencies, they matter a lot, right? We don't necessarily feel it because we're just going along with our everyday situation, our everyday lives, not thinking about what's going on globally or in terms of macroeconomics, but those things matter. Now, let's briefly talk about how this bond system works so you can understand this and why it puts pressure on the United States. Here's the simple version, guys. Other countries own a lot of U.S. debt. Other countries, they buy our bonds and they expect us to pay them back with interest. So some of the top countries that hold U.S. debt include Japan, and they're number one. They've been number one in terms of owning U.S. debt for the last several years. Then you got the U.K., you got China, you got some of the oil producing nations, you got the tiny little country of Luxembourg over in Europe, you got Belgium, you got Canada, you also have Brazil, by the way. Altogether, foreign nations hold right now around $9 trillion in U.S. treasuries. Now, here's the problem with this. If the U.S. starts to look riskier and riskier, buyers of U.S. bonds will ultimately demand higher interest to lend us money, or they'll slowly decide to own less and less U.S. debt. And when the U.S. has to pay more interest, the U.S. will eventually raise the cost of what we have to pay for loans of all types. And it can ultimately have an effect even on the stock market. That's how big this thing is, because everything in our financial system is connected to treasury rates. Okay. When treasury rates go up, almost everything else goes up too. This is why a downgrade in the U.S. credit, or even the possibility of a downgrade of the U.S. credit rating, it affects everyday Americans in what we do, in what we're trying to buy, in terms of our purchasing power, right? Now, you've all heard people say, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, right? We've all heard that. But here's what that really means. Most of the world buys and sells things using US dollars. Oil, gas, shipping, metal, whatever. Almost all are priced in US dollars. Also, other countries save their extra money by buying U.S. government bonds. It's like their version of a big savings account, right? And these other countries, they trust our U.S. bonds oftentimes more than their own money, right? And global banks use American dollars to send money between countries, right? So the U.S. dollar is basically the world's default money system, right? This gives the U.S., don't get me wrong now, this gives the U.S. a ton of power. We know that. But here's the issue. Brics nations, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Plus, you got new members of the Brics, right? Saudi Arabia, UAE, right? And you got Egypt, I think, over there. They don't like America having this much power, right? The US dollar being the world's global currency. These BRIC nations, they don't like that. They want trade that does not automatically use US dollars. They want a banking system that does not rely so heavily on the US dollar. And also these BRICS nations, they want savings that don't depend strictly primarily so heavily on US bonds. So when the US gets downgraded, it helps the cause of the Brics nations, right? It helps their argument. And it makes some other countries think, well, maybe the US is not as stable as it used to be. And that matters on a global scale. It may not matter in 2027 and 2028, but it may matter a whole lot more in 2037 and 2038. And who knows what it means for 2050 and beyond. So hear me, guys. A downgrade will not break the economy today, okay? But it will make life a little more expensive and more unstable over time. A downgrade in the US credit rating can keep borrowing costs higher for longer, more years, more decades. And it could make mortgages more expensive, car loans more expensive, push up credit card interest and personal loan rates, right? And it could make the stock market bounce around a little more and force the government, the US government, to spend more on interest and less on defense and less on social programs or whatever it could be trying to do and fund right here in America. And watch this, it could make it harder for retirement accounts to grow as fast 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. And it can also slowly weaken the value of the US dollar over time. This is not going to be a sudden crash, right? It's a slow moving problem, the kind of problem that most people ignore until it's too late. Here's the bigger picture. America is losing a little bit of its grip, folks. Yes, America is still strong. We know that. Still the biggest economy. We know that. And it still has a safe bond market that most countries around the world respect and believe in. And the dollar is still the world's reserve currency. But the debt's growing faster than ever. Shutdowns and political fights are just making things worse. Interest costs are going up. Foreign countries are slowly changing their buying habits from America. And the rating agencies are not just warning, they're actually putting in place measures to downgrade the U.S. credit rating. The downgrade in 2025, just a few months back, that wasn't the end, guys. That may be the beginning. This is not just about the numbers. It's about the direction that America is heading. And if nothing else changes, another downgrade or another negative outlook is absolutely possible, because America's credit story it's not really no longer about the numbers per se. It's really about the direction over the next 10, 15, 20 years that we're going. Look, guys, I just wanted to share with you what America's next big problem is. It's already here. It's happening right now in a really subtle way. So my biggest plea to you is get ready. Look, I hope you got some value out of this quick video. If you got value from this video, smash that like button for me. Let me know in the comments below. You can just say, hey, I got value. Or drop me a comment and let me know what you think. And be sure to check out my new book, Manage Your Way to Millions. It's the blueprint for taking control of your money on purpose. And if you want to go deeper behind the scenes with me, guys, join us on Patreon. Remember, the best person to take care of the old you is not the government. It's not your kids or your grandkids, and it's definitely not the nursing home. The best person to take care of the old you is the young you. Until the next video, peace.